And here we go, and good morning. I don't know if any of you have stepped out this morning, but it really is the first morning of 2023 where fall is in the air. I don't know what it is about this time of year, but I start noticing it after, I know it sounds crazy, but after the 4th of July, it has something to do with the sun positioning as it starts to move north or south. And it's the shadows or something that I start to sense fall early on after the 4th. But this morning, I mean, we had a lot of summer left, but this morning, if you step out, it's really, here we go again. You know, it's coming again. So fall is on. It's cool to be in a place with the 4 seasons most of the time. And we've got here, Sterling is going to join us. I'll stop here for a minute. Sterling, there he is. Good morning. Good morning, Sterling. Good to see you, Sterling. I prompted the guys that we should always laugh at your jokes and treat you nicely. So welcome to our study. Sterling and I met last May in Wisconsin and fished together at a camp and became fast friends. And he, out of his kindness, decided to come out and help us with one of our camps this summer, and which he did. And we've just kind of maintained this relationship. And he was interested in the study. So Sterling, thanks for joining us this morning. And feel free to, you know, our names are on the screen, and feel free to ask questions. Some of your good questions like you come up with. So
okay.
Last time we pondered how Jesus responded to this known betrayer named Judas. And you know, definitely taking a position on that I'll mention a little bit later. I mean, there's lots of different ways to cast Judas. And my proposal is just one way, of course, and take it and do with it what you will. We see Jesus extending a friendship symbol towards the known betrayer. That was depicted by the dipping of the bread and giving it to Jesus. His last act towards Judas before Judas left is, I'm interpreting that as an act of friendship and inclusion. And that, again, that is a perspective. We then discussed the 2 questions at the end of last time. What does this tell you in regard to how God thinks? If this is true, how does God think? And then secondly, how are we invited to think as well? Good morning, Jeff. Good to see you as well.
Morning.
Meet Sterling. Sterling, meet Jeff.
Hey, Jeff.
So today's text we read, after this, Satan then entered him. And my comment is, welcome to our study, Sterling. You know, after this, Satan, that's a big mouthful right there, and we're going to look at it. After this, that is the interaction with Jesus and Judas. Morning, Bill.
Morning.
And meet Sterling, Bill.
Hey,
After
Bill.
this,
Hello.
Satan entered him. Therefore, Jesus said to him, what you are doing to Judas, do it quickly. Now, none of those reclining at the table knew for what purpose he had said this to him. For some were assuming, since Judas kept the money box, that Jesus was saying to him, buy the things we need for the feast, or else that he was to give something to the poor. So, after receiving the piece of bread, he left, that's Judas, left immediately, and it was night. That's the text for this morning. Let's dive in. I'd like to look at 13:27. There's the text, already read it. When we come to verse 27, after this, Satan entered him. You know, our mind, we do one of two things. One is our minds immediately adhere to a predetermined notion of how I should think about this text, this personage of Satan actually entering the body of Judas. And that's, that's how many of us have been taught. And of course, I'm respectful of that. And, or our minds start thinking, gee, how should I think about this? Is there a different way to think about this? Not that we need a different way, but what is actually going on here? And so we engage in a theological discussion, and what we're seeking to do is discern what the author means. That's the end point. What did John, the writer of the gospel, mean when he said that Satan entered Judas? So that's what our little problem is this morning, or our task. We've chosen here in this study, and I put the note here, contrary to some people, to interpret Jesus's last act towards Judas as an extension of friendship. Now, that in itself is I'm not trying to take a stand. That's how I interpret, and that's how I feel is faithful to the heart of God as exemplified through Christ. But not everyone, guys, I think you're aware now, Judas is cast in many minds as a very evil, animated by the great power of evil himself, and was out to betray Jesus from the very beginning. I don't take that stance. As I've already said, I take the stance that I think that Judas was a well-intentioned but very misinformed through his own development of his own self-centered plan. And he was basically working from a zealot perspective, trying to usher in the kingdom of God and forcing the hand of Jesus through his act in order to take the messiahship of rule and kick Rome out of Israel. That's a short synopsis. And that is one position. I understand that. And it's not in sync with any interpretation is not in sync with everybody. So we've chosen to interpret Jesus's last act towards Judas as an extension of friendship. We already looked at that. Fully aware, Jesus was fully aware of the intention residing in Judas's heart, that he knew that the betrayal would occur. At this moment in time, the spotlight, if it were depicted on a live stage, the characters would be frozen in place. And while Jesus and Judas are having this interaction, the set would be dark. And after Jesus's words to Judas, the spotlight of all time beams on Judas's face, and we're all begging for, at this last chance here, what is he going to do? So that's how I depict it. So the final gesture of what I think is absolute love, not a giving over, as some would say, to Satan through this act. I think it has to do of absolute and genuine love and extension towards Judas. It precipitates the tipping point for Judas to surrender to the power of darkness. At this interaction right here, is a tipping point in Judas's mind. Tatsu, what are your thoughts?
I was just wondering, do you think that Jesus is talking to Judas, or is he talking to Satan?
Well, my perception, and I think that that could be a point of discussion regarding how one views Satan, the person of Satan. my perception is that Jesus is talking to Judas, and I think as we move on in the text, you know, I'll give you my reasoning.
Okay.
Yeah. So anyway, good question. As we continue in verse 27, there came a time in Judas's experience where his need to execute his own plan. Again, this is a self-created Judas plan from my perspective. And his plan extrapolated to a point where the plan itself superseded any appeal to reconsider what he was about to do. It's like when, well, it's not like, it's when we become so self-absorbed with an idea that we can't see anything else. And I believe that is a very common human experience. And I think that is going on here with Satan, with Judas. At this point in our story, he simply could not hear because he was overwhelmed by one voice to act in one way. There was no margin to reconsider. There was no capacity to listen. He therefore had to do what he bounded himself to do. Now, again, this is from my perspective that Judas created this plan, and this plan developed to a point where now the plan dominated his own thinking and his own actions. And his plan was to usher in the kingdom of God, to basically to help Jesus get his job done. And now that is, again, one interpretation. The author, from my perspective, describes this moment that we're seeing right here as the term Satan then entered him. It means that he was overwhelmed at this point, lost all aspects of reasoning power, and became so absorbed to carry out what he had intended to do. Now, where does that come from? I think it's helpful to compare how in back in chapter 8, verses 30 through 59, we're not going to reference it. I just surmised it here. This idea of the term there is used, the devil, you are of your father, the devil. Here, Satan enters him. There's one other time in the text in John where the direct term devil or Satan is used. But it's helpful to note how Jesus utilized this term. In 8:30 through 59, we find Jesus in a heated discussion with known believers. Verse 31, he's talking to people who have believed in him. But these people are bound and determined not to give up their constructs of thinking, of their thinking. That's the text where he says, we are of our father Abraham. And Jesus said, if your father is Abraham, then do the deeds of Abraham. They were heated. They were believers, as it says in verse 31, but they were refusing to let go of their own self-created constructs. They were in a deep self-protective mode of thinking. Their refusal in that text leads them within that text to a group decision to attempt to murder Jesus. They pick up stones in verse 59 to stone him. Of course, he escapes. During that time, in 44 through 59, Jesus cites their inability to hear. It's the same idea as right here. Judas had no ability to listen. he was just set in his ways to do what he had proposed to do. The same is true in 8:30 through 59 with a group of people. And Jesus correlates that type of thinking with, quote, you are of your father, the devil. So there's a known instance where Jesus is addressing believers and citing them, stating that they are following their father, the devil. And you can look that text up, verse 30 through 59, but it's the same, it's the same framework of thinking in regard to what we have here in the text. And John cites it as Satan entered him. Back to our text, at this moment, it is kind of a summary of 27. Judas was overtaken by an idea of which he himself had created, but he had no power to stop. There was no turning back. Thus, Satan entered him. Continuing on in the text, Jesus responds to Judas as his master. Jesus is the known master, and Judas is the disciple. And that context is right here, and referring back to verse 20. Jesus responds to Judas as his master by giving him a sending directive. The reason this is important is because Jesus prefaces this action in verse 20 when he says, truly, truly, I say to you, to the disciples, the one who receives anyone I send receives me. The anyone here, from my perspective and in context to the text itself, is Judas. Judas is the anyone, and he is sending Judas right here in this text. Jesus says, anyone I send receives me, and the one who receives me receives him who sent me. We talked extensively last week about this idea of inclusion. I believe the teaching of Jesus here is to include include even the betrayer, if that were to occur. Our text reads right there in verse 27, Jesus says to Judas, what you are doing. Tatsi, this addresses your question. Judas himself is the source. I don't believe Jesus is talking to Satan from this text. There is no second entity. Jesus is talking to Judas and identifying Judas with the source. He is the one responsible for his actions. He says to Judas, what you are doing, Judas, what you're in the process of. Then he follows up with that quote, do it quickly. That describes how he is being sent. Jesus is giving the follower a directive, and I think it has a correlation back to verse 20. A lot going on here, guys, so I'm glad we got the slides. His self-derived, that's Judas, his self-serving plan is no different. I'm backing away from the text here and thinking about this and proposing this idea. Judas's self-serving plan is no different in my mind than what we somewhat well-intended Christian people, in a very broad sense here. It's happened to all of us, and me, I have been a perpetrator of this kind of thinking, where I derive a plan in my head and I attribute it to God's plan. There has been absolutely atrocious things that Christian people do to Christian and non-Christian people and attribute it to God's plan. And I think that is a direct correlation with what's going on with Judas thinks in his head he's carrying out God's plan from my perspective. When Judas perceived the trigger time, like, here's my opportunity at this moment in the text, he fully engaged with no thought of turning back. The plan takes over with the force and power that transcends all intervention possibilities. Now, here's a note. I'm very cautious on, I'm not driving home a point here. And I'm fully aware how this text is interpreted by others. I'm choosing the path that I'm doing, or path I'm on, because I think honestly that it's closer to the original intention of John the writer. So right or wrong, I'm not saying this is the way it is, but this is how I'm seeing it. And my intention is fully to be attempting to understand what John is attempting to communicate. The Bible is absolutely clear on the idea that Satan exists. I actually agree with that. I mean, that absolutely is clear. But how Satan exists is worthy to think about and to discuss. How do we think about this idea of Satan? We don't have time to do that here. It's not the purpose of the text. And so at some future time, we may look at that. But you can look at, within this study on the Christ and Rocky's website, under blog Gospel of John, we looked at this back at weeks 120A and B. It's split in two parts, and there's a whole set of notes there that really enforce this kind of thinking. So if you want more information, you can go there. But right now we want to move on to verse 28. Now, this is happening in the room, and none of the disciples at the table, this is at the Last Supper, none of them knew for what purpose he had said this to him. John is clear on that. Nobody knew what was going on. And of course, I think we've just kind of passed over that in the past, but let's think about that. As we discussed prior, the disciples were entangled within their own personal state of unknowing. That's from prior study. Their entire perspective, remember, they're going around the table say, is it I? Someone's going to betray me. And they were so self-centered, not because they're less intelligent or bad guys, they're human. And my perspective is that they're reacting from a very human way of thinking. They don't know if they're the betrayer. They honestly don't know. And that's why they're in a state of unknowing. So their perspective goes inward and they're focused on themselves. They simply, at that moment, don't have the mental capacity to discern the meaning of what is occurring. And in our modern vernacular terms, we call it being clueless. They are absolutely clueless to what is going on. The entirety of the discipleship group is clueless. And it's not, if I were there, if you and I were there, we would be clueless. Their cluelessness supports the idea. Now, this is, in my opinion, important. It supports the idea that nothing in Judas's words or actions, as witnessed by the others during the entirety of the public ministry, raised any degree of uncertainty in regard to his intentions towards Jesus. They had no idea of the Judas that we now have within the 21st century. I'd be curious, those of you who have watched The Chosen, how do they depict Judas? I haven't seen it, so I don't know. How is Judas depicted within the discipleship group?
Pretty excitable kind of guy who's happy to join along. He's a happy, willing believer jumping into the group.
So is there any depiction of him having these side conversations with the devil and planning this whole plan?
No, there's a little, every so often he'll make some comment affecting to the fact that he's a bit of a zealot, but I think it's
so
not.
they depict him. So they depict him as the zealot.
Not like Simon.
Right.
No, Simon's definitely zealot. He's just sort of he's pretty innocent as far as you watch him so far in the first three chapters of that.
Interesting.
I like.
He was
Go ahead.
just like one of the guys, actually, the way I looked at it. Yeah.
Well, I think there's a lot, guys, there is a lot of thought behind that. They just didn't come up with that. Because there's not a lot of people that agree that Judas' intentions were noble. He was just extremely skewed in his execution. Yes, Jeff.
Hey, Mike, I just got a question. Because of the statement that none of them knew what Judas's intentions were, but in an earlier passage, it said, or John alluded to the fact that Judas had been helping himself to the till.
Yeah.
And I don't know when he became aware of that, if it was after this act,
Great
or
insight.
if he knew ahead of time, and he may have been thinking, well, man, this guy is stealing from us. He's probably the one that's going to go and betray. I don't think that's the case, but I just don't know. I just wanted to kind of throw that out to everybody and say, hey, do you think John or even some of the other disciples knew that Judas was stealing from them, and that his being part of this, that they knew he was not really one of them?
Jeff, another
fascinating.
great insight. And what we're attempting to do in our interpretation is, how do you take those two texts? We automatically think about a prior text informing a latter text, which there's truth to that. But here it's plainly stated by John, none of those at the table knew for what purpose he had said that. There's no other comment. Now, how do you reconcile that with what you just said? I don't really know.
Yeah, and to me, as I talked about it and thought about it, I think that, John is writing this later, and he probably just realized, hey, we didn't figure it out at this point, but later on we figured out that, hey, he was stealing from us. Maybe it was one of the women that said, hey, this till's a little light, and we think that Judas is involved or something. I don't know. But I was trying to reconcile those two things, that he was stealing from them, but nobody knew that he was the one that was going to betray.
I think you're thinking right along the right path, that when John wrote this, it's not like he wrote down at the end of every day and wrote memoirs of what happened today. There is no chronology within the writing. It's how he fabricated the story together much later in time. And there was, earlier in the text, he chose to include that. Here, he chose to say nobody knew. So, yeah, Bill.
It's interesting. Jeff mentioned that. We forget that, but we're kind of at a dividing point of us. Is Judas a sort of a deep thinker plotting all along to turn Jesus over? Or was he just a common criminal, just in it for the money? And because that little comment of John kind of diminishes any depth to Judas at all, but he was just kind of stealing from the purse, and he sold Jesus for 30 coins, and he was much more shallow than that.
Yeah, that's true. I think the thing that really strikes me in verse 28 and again, how my mind is working is that the statement is clear that nobody knew for what purpose that was going to happen, and that there were no, I've derived from this text, there were no clues given by Judas's words or actions that would appoint him to the bad guy during the course of the public ministry. So that's where I'm landing on it, Jeff. And I think we're free to do with it what we want, but that to me, that's a pretty important piece of verse 28. We don't see any of the disciples making the connection from verse 28 of what is going to happen. As the text reads, there were none. Verse 29 is an extrapolation, for some were assuming, since Judas kept the money box, that Jesus was saying to him, go buy what we need for the feast. Or else others thought he was giving something to the poor, that, he was the treasurer, so he had the money box, and there were some conjecture of what was exchanging between Judas and Jesus. But yet no one nailed into what was about to occur. Verse 29 extrapolates on the disciples' inability to discern. The disciples saw and they heard the exchange between Jesus and Judas, but through their past experience with Judas and by applying their own self-created filters, what they saw was entirely different than what was actually occurring. And what they interpreted, this is, again, I think this is worthy to think about. What they interpreted at this moment is what they saw from their own experience. Their lenses was informing them how they saw this interaction. And the way I state that is they saw themselves. I think this is a human, universal reality. They actually saw what they had created in their heads to see through their own experiences and through their own filters that they had created. And it's my opinion, guys, this is, again, an opinion. What is true of them is true of us all humans. We as humans tend to interpret what we see through our own self-created lenses, filters. A general human tendency is therefore we see, but we fail to discern. Thus, why we have multiple stories on an incident, multiple different witness of an explanation of an occurrence, because we're all seeing it through our own lenses. Verse 30 is the last verse in this text, and we're going to move to table time. So John closes this section by a summary statement, and he says, so after a conclusive statement, after receiving the piece of bread, which we looked at last week, Judas left immediately under the directive of Jesus, and it was night. There's a mouthful there. Last time we discussed that Jesus's last act towards the known betrayer was an extension of intimate friendship. Again, that's an interpretation. This was symbolized through the dipping and the giving of the bread. Here we see Judas receiving the symbol, but rejecting the substance. He took the bread, but he left Jesus's presence. Come hell or high water, Judas was determined to carry out what he had created. Outwardly, he received, but inwardly, he was determined to do it the Judas way. The result of this humanly shared modus operandi, commonly shared within our experiences, is stated by the author as one word: night. Judas walked out into the night. In our story, we have the seeking Jesus, even to the extent towards a known betrayer. We also have the clueless disciples and the self-determined Judas. Three sets of characters. Judas leaves the 12 immediately. The door closes behind him, and all he saw was the darkness of night. What do you think? Here's our questions for discussion. What do you think was going through Judas's mind as he stepped out into the darkness? And then secondly, what do you think was going on in Jesus's mind as he watched the door closing? So two aspects of the same action, the closing door. What was going through his head, and what was going through Jesus's head as he watched Judas exit the room? What do you think, guys? It is wide open here.
Sometimes self-pride gets in the way. You make plans, you make promises, especially when you make promises towards a future event, towards helping someone. As you go through with it, you think suddenly like, this isn't a good idea, or I shouldn't be doing this, but the momentum's going towards it, and I don't want to embarrass myself by slamming the brakes on it. So you follow through, and that's painful. I've done that a couple of times.
Yeah. If I understand what you're saying, Bill, I've experienced that as well. And the way I describe that as being so overwhelmed by something that it takes control of me. Is that what you're saying?
Kind of. I mean, this is exceedingly personal. It's pretty intense, but I kind of had that feeling heading into my first marriage. The people were coming, the plans were laid, and I kept thinking, I don't know if this is the right person, but let's do it. And of course, we got divorced later.
Wow. Well, Bill, thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
Other thoughts?
Well, and we always put this, like you said, Mike, through our own filters. And trying to put myself in Judas's sandals. He's like, well, he knows what I'm gonna do. I might as well do. He's already said somebody's gonna betray him, and I'm that guy. Might as well. I don't know. It's difficult because you were saying Jesus extended the hand of friendship, and at that point, Judas could have said, no, this is a bad idea. I don't want to do this.
Yeah.
Because he knows what I'm doing. I've been found out, so I'm not going to do it. But because, and this is, he says Satan entered into him. And I believe in this case that Satan's plans came to fruition in Judas's mind. But I think that happens, in my own life too, when it comes to giving into temptation or something like that. I'm like, yeah, this is a bad idea. But then Satan is like, yeah, and he does that to all of us. I think he kind of talks us into doing something that we know is wrong because we are not in connection at that point, not that we lose connection with Christ, but we let things get in the way. We let the life interfere with our relationship with Christ to the point where we do things that we know we're not supposed to do. And I think it's something similar here in that,
I think so too.
you know, Christ is trying to get us to live in obedience, and Satan is trying to get us to do just the opposite. And if we're not clinging to Christ, then we end up doing things that Satan is trying to convince us of, you know.
I think of Herod and
Well
Salome.
said, Jeff. Yeah. I'm sorry, but
I think of Herod and John the Baptist and Salome. He didn't want to kill John the Baptist, but he got put on the spot, promising the world to this little girl dancing for him. And he did not want to look bad. He did not want to embarrass himself. So he followed through with it against his will, I think, according to the Bible. You know,
yeah.
that was a very tragic event.
Mhm. I know. Tatsi, you're so compliant. You actually raise your hand, and I see your hand on the thing. Go ahead, Tatsi.
You know, in the last lesson and this lesson, what's been going through my mind is, and I'm basing it actually in Ephesians verses 4-5, okay, in which it brings to me the question that I've always had is, you know, if God always predetermines everything, he determines that I was going to be a Christian, then when I became a Christian, and that was when I made a choice. Okay, so that same idea I think has been going through me through this, in that, you know, and this whole thing with Satan and whatever is the Jesus, and that's what I think was going through Jesus's mind, is he was thinking actually like God. He knew that he was going to go to the cross, and that he was going to, you know, die and then be resurrected. Okay, and throughout the whole scriptures leading up to this, even though he's given clues throughout to the disciples, they don't have a clue in their minds of what's going to happen. They actually had to go through the experience before they really understood what was going on.
That's true.
And so I think that's the interaction here, is that, you know, Judas in a way fit into God's plan of what was going to happen to Christ in terms of being resurrected, you know, die and be resurrected. But so he was into that plan. He still had the choice of not doing that, but I think it was God's plan that's what he was going to do. He was going to betray him, and you know, God was going to allow that to happen. To fit in with the overall plan. So I think it's really geared to the overall plan of that is in Jesus's mind of what he was going to go through, because he knew exactly what he was going to go through. And anyway, that's my thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Tatsi. And Bill, following suit.
I'll shut up. It's been a long time. About 4 or 5 years ago, they re-released the Jesus Christ Superstar musical. And I copied and watched it. And it's interesting that the gospel, according to Andrew Lloyd Webber, the whole story is told through Judas's eyes. And I find that fascinating. And he says, why am I being the victim here? Why am I, why me is kind of the sum of the whole event. You know, it's worth watching.
So again, another interpretation of that interaction. Yeah. All right.
You know, Mike, as far as the question of what's going on,
in mind,
in Jesus's mind in this case, he watches the door close, and I know that his heart was breaking. He said, "This guy has followed me, and I know he's part of the Father's plan for all of this, but it just breaks my heart that he didn't accept extension of friendship, and he's allowed Satan to convince him that this is what he needs to do. But he says that to me every time I do something stupid. Every time I sin, I'm sure Jesus goes, Jeff, I know you love me, but man, you're breaking my heart. And I think that's what he was thinking with Judas.
Yeah, I think so too. And another really good comment, and what's a bit unfortunate, but just because of time, we're not moving into verse 31 because there is going to be a revelatory explanation of what has just occurred. And when Jesus said, "In here is God glorified." Now we're going to look at what all that means, but it's like, pay attention, folks, because this is what God is, as we see depicted right here. Thus, the emphasis on the extension of friendship, even with a known betrayer. And we'll talk about that next time. But
Excuse me, Mike. I've got an appointment to go to, so I'm gonna say goodbye to you guys this week. I'll catch you next week.
All right.
thanks,
See you,
thanks,
Vince.
Vince. Yeah, thanks for coming in. Yep, thanks. Many of your comments have been on the fact that you guys can feel this. Jeff, your last comment is watching his friend, the breaking of his heart. I share that. I share that feeling within this text. I have been on both. I've been a perpetrator and I've been a receiver. And I have learned, at least from at this stage in life, that sometimes we have to go through what we have to go through. And there's no one that's going to talk me out of it because I'm hell-bent on what my plan is. And I think that is applied here. There's only been one instance in my life that I can remember where I was talked out of something. And it was when I was a very young man. I don't think I was 20 yet. Sandra and I were dating and our relationship was getting closer. And I got this wild hair idea to go on this adventure across the United States, this, kind of this CC Rider kind of adventure nomad kind of thing and live off the land. And I was going to I had a good job, doing my apprenticeship. And I was bent on doing this, having this 6-month adventure that really it was a kid plan. And I kept talking about it and pushing it. And I was talked out of it. And this is the only time when I was so set on this plan. And it was through my dad. He set me aside one night. He was crying. And he says, I'll never forget this, guys. He said, you've got a lovely young woman who loves you. And you've got a good job here. And he cited some other reasoning, but I remember those two. And he says, I really ask you to consider or reconsider not doing this. And that broke me to hear my dad share at that level, which was not really him. And that little 10-minute instance changed my course of thinking. And guys, what changed me was love. It was the love of my father. Unfortunately, I see this scene as much the same, but unfortunately here, Judas chose his plan. And he had to go through hell, unfortunately. Can you guys resonate to the idea that when people are bound and determined to do it their way, sometimes they just have to go through it? And I see a nodding, Bill. And Jeff, you've already talked about it. That's how, that's how I'm casting it. Bob, it's about time in our discussion that you come up with your sage responses here. So
Keep talking, Mike. No sage response.
I talk too much.
Mike, this may be a rabbit trail.
Yeah.
But just a thought. When the verse, it was odd to me that he would just say, and it was night.
Yeah.
But then I look back in scripture where it says, when we sin at night.
Yeah.
We sin when we think God can't see us. But, in the daytime, we're more afraid to do that, of getting caught or whatever. And I think that's poignant to me, is that this took place at night. That Judas was like, I don't want to get caught by the other guys doing this, so I got to do this at night. And maybe that was what John's point was, that
I think so.
this was the ultimate sin. This was the turning against Christ, the ultimate sin, and we do our sinning at night, and it struck me.
Yeah. Very, yes. I don't think it was an accident that it was
No.
yeah.
It strikes me that before earlier they talk about the Jews were looking for a way to get Jesus. I mean, they were looking for it. Now Judas provided it, but I think we have to realize that if Judas hadn't provided it, they would still have tried to find a way. You know what I'm saying? Is Judas had the option of staying with them, and this still could have come out to be a crucifixion. He just didn't have to.
Yeah.
He didn't have to facilitate it.
Yeah, I think I understand. I think I understand what you're suggesting, that this master plan, if Judas would have yielded to the love of Christ extension here, it still would have happened.
Yeah, I mean, I think
I think so. Yeah,
because they wanted to do it. They were going after Jesus, and this just helped them.
yeah.
So I think at this juncture in the story, I tend to give Judas the benefit of the doubt. So, I mean, the Jews up until now were looking for a Messiah. They were looking for the kingdom of God, right, to actually arrive. And so I don't know where I got this idea, but I think Judas is just trying to help Jesus, trying to help the kingdom get here faster. And he wants to know why Jesus isn't like getting with the program more. So he's trying to help move things along a little bit. And so I think at this juncture in the story, Judas isn't angry at the rest of them.
Yeah.
This is his way to try to, which I say, force Jesus to become the Messiah that he said he was.
Yeah.
And I think it's not until after the garden scene where Judas really is filled with remorse, realizing that what he did.
Yeah.
I don't know.
So why is John?
That's how I'm seeing it too, John. I'm seeing it the same way.
Well, this is where Jeff's comment comes into play. John, the writer, has to kind of say, yeah, he was stealing from the purse, which kind of reduces that noble aspect to more of a trivial thief. You know, I'm trying to torn between who was Judas, the trivial thief or the great executor of pushing.
Well, it's stealing from the purse again. That idea, bad. Well, maybe Judas had rationalizations for every time he stole, in terms, again, trying to help the kingdom and, his way.
Yeah.
He's the one that got mad at, I guess it was Mary, for wasting all that perfume on Jesus, if you recall.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's another good point. That's two good pieces of the character of this guy. But anyway, I don't think it really matters, right? This betrayal idea, I think I shared this last week. Peter is the big betrayer, right? He's the one that's going to say 3 times while he's, to the girl and everybody else, I never knew him, right? And then the rest of them in the garden, when the soldiers show up, they all run away.
They scattered. Yeah.
They all run. So I think one of the morals to the story is we're all betrayers.
Hmm.
Right? So we all betray. And then your last question is, so how does Jesus, what's gone through his mind? How does Jesus see betrayers? And he offers this bread, he offers this to everybody. He offers, friendship, love, right? That's his response. And you see that response through the garden, through the cross. You see him being gracious almost to everybody. Father, forgive them, right? And
Yeah.
so it's, thank goodness we're on that side of if we want to receive that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So the great question is, what's the difference between Judas and Peter?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That's a great question.
Bye, everybody.
No,
I
no,
had
no,
to wait
no.
a
Drop the mic.
I love that question. Okay, because of time, I'm going to step in. I think the difference between the two, Bill, great question. And John, great comment. There's a betrayal in part of me. That's part of me. And I think I'm speaking for myself. The difference is our ability to receive forgiveness. Peter was able to receive the forgiveness. Judas was not, and it led him to self-despair, eventually suicide. He just couldn't receive it. Yeah, and that's the short of my answer to that great question. I don't know. What do you think, Bill?
Well, I did a whole teaching on this one time, but when it talks to, they quote a psalm called "My best friend has lifted up his heel against me," and it goes back to a psalm of David, who was afraid of a friend of his who was Ahithophel, who went on the other side to betray him, and when he didn't win the battle, he went out and hung himself. So he's tying a connection there. So if we dig into that connection, we might find a little bit of the answer.
Yeah, I'm sorry, my hearing. I got part of that, but
Well, I just gave part of it.
okay, all right. Yeah.
But there's a connection there. John the writer makes a connection with a psalm of David that makes a connection with another guy who hung himself when he betrayed David.
I see. Okay.
Yeah, and
Okay.
that's the
Yep.
story.
Yep. Okay. Now I could hear that. Thank you.
But, and I think too, Mike, what you said was true for all of us. That there are people who are able to accept forgiveness and find joy and find peace that only Christ can offer. And then there are people, Christ offers it to everybody, but there's people that cannot accept it, cannot accept forgiveness, cannot accept the peace that Christ offers, and they despair, just like Judas did. It may not lead to suicide, but it leads to death because of the inability to hear and accept what Christ is offering.
John calls it night. He calls it night.
Judas didn't see the
Didn't
resurrection. So there was despair. This was the Messiah. This was his hope. Crucified, dead, and buried. And that's the last thing Judas saw.
Mhm.
And all the others were running away and hiding out too. And so if you just waited a little bit.
He thought he was beyond forgiveness.
Yeah, he thought the guy forgiving him was beyond life.
That's really unfortunate. Yeah. Guys, it's 8:00 and we're gonna sign off. Another good discussion today and a very pointed and troubling text that we're all thinking about, and it's good to talk about it. Thank you for your comments. And I will not be here next week. I'll be in Buena Vista. So the week after, which will be September 6th, we'll get back on the 6th, and
No,
we'll be.
today's the 6th.
Oh,
Today.
excuse me. Yeah, excuse me. I'm yeah. Excuse me, Bill. It's the 20th.
You'll
Day
be
is
gone.
the 6th,
You're gonna be
and
gone on the 13th.
I'll be gone on the 13th. Yeah. But like always, you guys get together. Very interesting text coming up in verse 31, and we'll look at that next time. In really, in light of the bigger picture as commented, as depicted by John the writer. So thank you guys. Thanks for the great comments. Sterling, thanks for joining in
Thank
today.
you. You guys are pretty heady.
Sterling.
And we'll see you next time. Bye
Good
for
to see
now.
you, Bill.
All right,
Glad you're
bye.
back.